Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise and get you straight to the essential insights. Today we're diving headfirst into the high stakes, really rapid-fire legislative action unfolding right now in Washington, D.C. Our central topic, President Donald Trump's ambitious, sweeping, big, beautiful bill. Our mission today is, well, to help you quickly grasp the crucial insights and maybe some surprising facts about this massive legislative push. We're going to unpack its key provisions, the intense debate swirling around it, and what its passage or failure could really mean. We're pulling insights directly from recent reports by Fox News and CNN Politics to give you, hopefully, a well-rounded view.
And it is an immense undertaking. I mean, this bill aims to bring significant, potentially lasting change across, well, numerous sectors. We're talking taxes, the border, energy, defense. It even grapples with the national debt limit, all kind of wrapped into one package. And President Trump has set a very, very aggressive deadline for this. He's pushing for a signing by the 4th of July.
The 4th of July? Wow. That gives Congress a remarkably short window for such an impactful piece of legislation.
Exactly. It's incredibly fast-paced.
Okay, so let's unpack this bill itself. It's an exceptionally sweeping piece of legislation, clearly designed to consolidate major aspects of the president's agenda. But right at its heart, as you might expect, is a huge debate about its true cost.
That's absolutely right. The core point of contention really revolves around its projected impact on the federal deficit. Critics, particularly members of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, they've publicly stated that the Senate's version of the bill would add a staggering, their words, $1.3 trillion to the federal deficit over a decade.
$1.3 trillion.
Yeah. Now, you contrast that with the House-passed bill, which projected only a $72 billion increase. They've gone as far as to highlight that even without interest costs, this Senate figure is $651 billion over their agreed budget framework. So a big gap there.
And it gets even more complex, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Senate bill also includes an extra $1 trillion increase to the national debt ceiling.
That's right, the borrowing limit.
Compared to the House version. Plus, it aims to make certain corporate tax cuts from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA,
Right.
permanent, while the House only proposed extending them temporarily. And that distinction feels pretty crucial.
Oh, absolutely. Making tax cuts permanent locks in their costs for decades to come, it significantly impacts future revenue projections. And this leads us directly to it's technical, but it's critically important, the scoring debate.
Right, how they calculate the cost.
Exactly, how the bill's cost is actually calculated. There are two primary methods at play here. First, there's the current policy baseline, which the Senate is currently using. This method effectively zeroes out the cost of extending those expiring TCJA tax cuts by treating them as if they are already permanent policy.
Even though they're set to expire.
Exactly. Remember, absent congressional action, these cuts are set to expire at the end of 2025. The second method is the current law baseline. That's the traditional approach used by the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. And this method assumes that the expiring provisions of the 2017 Trump tax cuts do lapse as scheduled under current law.
Okay, so the difference in projections based on these baselines must be pretty significant.
Oh, it's dramatic. Nothing short of dramatic. The CBO, using that traditional current law baseline, projected the Senate bill would add nearly $3.3 trillion to the deficit over a decade.
$3.3 trillion.
Wow. But then a separate CBO estimate, using the current policy baseline that the Senate favors, projected the exact same Senate version would cost roughly $508 billion over the next decade.
So wait, from $3.3 trillion down to about $500 billion just based on the accounting method?
Precisely. This isn't just about accounting. It's, a political battleground. The choice of baseline can make a multi-trillion-dollar difference on paper. It effectively allows one side to present a bill as far less costly than another method would suggest. It's a key strategic tool in these legislative battles to sort of control the narrative around spending.
Right. It frames the whole debate differently.
Indeed. And the Senate version is deemed costlier by critics, primarily because, well, it contained the bigger tax cuts, while simultaneously shrinking some of the spending cuts and revenue generators that were in the House bill. Mark Goldwayne, he's the senior policy director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, put it quite bluntly. He stated the Senate version expands the giveaways and shrinks the takeaways.
Okay, but there's a counter-argument, right, from the supporters.
Oh, definitely. A strong counter-argument.
Yeah, GOP aid, for instance, claims the Senate version contains more Byrd-compliant savings. We'll get to Byrd later than the House. They also say it correctly scores current tax policy as revenue neutral and assumes economic growth was previously underestimated.
Great, the growth argument.
And the White House Council of Economic Advisors, they're projecting a massive $4.1 trillion in economic growth because of the tax permanence, which they say far surpasses the House version's impact.
And Senate Republicans are claiming $1.6 trillion in spending cuts over 10 years.
Okay.
Which, they point out, actually exceeds the House Freedom Caucus's own demand of $1.5 trillion.
So if we try to simplify this numerical maze, what we're really looking at are two wildly different visions of fiscal responsibility.
That's a good way to put it.
Each supported by its own set of numbers, its own baseline, which ultimately makes it incredibly difficult to pin down the actual cost of this bill, depending on whose math you're using.
Exactly. It's very confusing for anyone trying to follow along.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Here's where it gets particularly impactful, I think, for everyday Americans, because this bill has profound implications for healthcare, especially Medicaid.
Absolutely. The deep cuts proposed for Medicaid are a major flashpoint in this whole debate. The Senate version is projected by the CBO to leave 11.8 million more people uninsured by 2034.
11.8 million.
Yeah, and to give you some perspective, that's even higher than the 10.9 million projected by the House-passed version.
So both versions project millions losing coverage, but the Senate's is higher.
That's correct. Both chambers are proposing truly historic spending cuts to Medicaid, which, currently covers over 71 million low-income Americans. It's a huge program.
And putting numbers on those cuts, how deep are we talking?
Well, the Senate version would slash federal support for Medicaid by about $930 billion over a decade. That compares to the House version's reduction of approximately $800 billion.
So $930 billion cut in the Senate version. That's massive. And it still projects more uninsured people than the House. That's a staggering figure, especially considering Medicaid already covers, 71 million Americans? What kind of ripple effect does that create across the healthcare system? I mean, not just for those individuals, but for hospitals, local economy.
Oh, it creates enormous pressure, huge pressure. And adding to the controversy are these new work requirements.
Yes, the work requirements.
For the first time in the program's, 60-year history, both chambers would require certain able-bodied adults, ages 19 to 64, to work to maintain their Medicaid benefits. And crucially, the Senate version would impose this work requirement on parents of children ages 14 and older, while the House version would exempt parents of dependent children. So there's a key difference there.
So the Senate is stricter on parents.
Yes. And this isn't just a budget cut. You could argue it's a philosophical reorientation of the social safety net, kind of shifting Medicaid from maybe a pure entitlement for the needy towards a more conditional benefit.
And there are other differences too, right, in the details?
Yes, some more nuanced ones. The Senate version lowers the cap on taxes states can levy on healthcare providers to help fund the program. It also increases reimbursement rates, but, and this is key, this only applies to the 40 states in D.C. that expanded Medicaid under the ACA.
Okay, so non-expansion states don't get that benefit.
Correct. The House bill, by contrast, would put a moratorium on existing state provider taxes. So, yeah, different mechanisms at play.
What's the reaction been from the administration's allies on these healthcare changes? Has there been pushback?
Well, they're defending it quite strongly. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt dismissed concerns. She stated the bill protects Medicaid for those who truly deserve this program, naming the needy, pregnant women, children, sick Americans who physically cannot work. She argued the cuts primarily target waste, fraud, and abuse.
Okay, the classic waste, fraud, and abuse line.
Right. And similarly, Senator Jim Banks defended the bill, saying cuts would only affect able-bodied Americans who, in his view, shouldn't receive Medicaid without working.
So the argument is it's targeting a specific group, not the traditionally vulnerable.
That's the framing, yeah.
Okay, so beyond the specifics of what's in the bill, there's this incredibly intense procedural battle taking place in the Senate. You mentioned it briefly.
Absolutely.
Republicans are leveraging the budget reconciliation process to advance this massive bill. That's a really significant strategic move, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
This budget reconciliation, it's not just legislative jargon. It's kind of like a procedural superpower, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
It means they only need a simple 51-vote majority to pass this massive bill. They get to bypass the Senate's usual 60-vote hurdle and the threat of a Democratic filibuster.
Exactly. It's the tool you use to push through big, often controversial legislation without needing bipartisan buy-in.
And within that process, there's something called the bird bath.
Yes, the famous bird bath, named after Senator Robert Byrd. This is where the Senate parliamentarian currently, Elizabeth McDonough, who is a nonpartisan official, meticulously combs through the bill. Her job is to ensure every piece of it adheres to strict budgetary guidelines. Basically, does it primarily deal with the budget?
And if it doesn't?
It gets stripped out. We know many key provisions that were originally in the House bill were actually removed because they were deemed not to be Byrd compliant. They didn't have a direct enough budgetary impact.
So one unelected official can have a huge say in what stays in the bill.
It underscores how much power the parliamentarian can wield in this specific process, yes.
Okay, and then there's the vote of Rama. Sounds fun, probably isn't.
Slight chuckle. Probably not fun for the senators. It's a marathon voting session on amendments. It's expected to take hours, potentially all night long.
All night, wow.
Yeah. And this is a crucial chance for senators, particularly the minority party, in this case the Democrats, to offer basically any amendment they want. It forces votes on politically difficult issues for the majority, Republicans here, effectively putting them on the record on potentially uncomfortable topics. It's partly legislative theater, but it can have real consequences.
Gotcha. So who are the key senators we should be watching as this unfolds? Any particular names popping up?
Definitely. Several key senators are drawing attention. Senator Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina.
Right, you mentioned him earlier.
Yes. He actually voted against advancing the bill initially and has since announced he will not seek re-election. And he vocally criticized the Medicaid cuts. He had that quote asking, "What do I tell 663,000 people in 2 years or 3 years when President Trump breaks his promise by pushing them off of Medicaid because the funding's not there anymore, guys?" Very pointed.
Yeah, that's pretty direct. Who else?
Then there's Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's a noted fiscal hawk. He stated he plans to vote against the bill specifically due to the $5 trillion debt ceiling increase included. He said, "It doesn't sound conservative to me."
Okay, so concerns from the fiscal conservative side, too.
Exactly. And then you have some potential swing votes, maybe. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. She notably crossed the aisle to vote with Democrats on several amendments related to SNAP, Medicaid, and shoring up rural hospitals. And this was despite the Senate bill, including a tax break apparently aimed at whalers in Alaska, seemingly for her benefit.
Interesting. So that didn't sway her on those other votes.
Apparently not. And Senator Susan Collins from Maine also broke with Republicans on votes protecting rural hospitals. She indicated she'd be leaning against the bill if it's not further changed, so she's keeping her options open.
Anyone else critical or pushing for specific changes?
Yes, Senator Rick Scott of Florida. He has an amendment that's strongly supported by the House Freedom Caucus. It would significantly hike the Medicaid financial burden for states that expanded under the Affordable Care Act. This could potentially add hundreds of billions in savings, on paper, and Representative Eric Burleson even suggested the bill's ultimate passage back in the House could hinge on Scott's amendment being included.
So that's a key one to watch for the House conservatives.
Definitely. On the other hand, you have someone like Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. He backed the bill despite having earlier expressed concerns about Medicaid provisions in rural hospitals, so he came around.
Okay, so a lot of moving parts, different pressures on different senators. But despite these hurdles and, dissenting voices, the White House is expressing confidence.
They are. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated her belief the bill would be on Trump's desk by the 4th of July deadline. And the president himself has been meeting with Senate Majority Leader John Thune and House Speaker Mike Johnson. It signals a very concerted effort, a full court press to push this legislation through.
So even with all these challenges, the administration is clearly laser-focused on getting this done. They see it as a major priority.
Absolutely. So with the Senate procedural battle raging and, key senators making their stands, you might think that covers the entirety of this big, beautiful bill.
You'd hope so.
But, well, with legislation of this scale, there are always layers upon layers, right? Beyond the headlines about cost and healthcare, this bill contains other significant elements that could, maybe more quietly, reshape aspects of our economy and society.
Like what? What else is buried in there?
Well, for instance, there are provisions that could fundamentally alter our energy future. Senate Republicans have proposed a, pretty controversial new tax on the burgeoning solar and wind industries.
A new tax on solar and wind. That seems like a huge development for the energy sector.
It is. Experts like Ed Mills of Raymond James called this, and I quote, "just a killer to the wind and solar industry." He stated it threatens a huge amount of power set to come online, especially given that these sources now make up the vast majority of new electricity added to the grid recently.
Wow. So that's a move that certainly signals a distinct shift in energy policy priorities away from renewables.
It would appear so, yes. And beyond energy, President Trump himself has made statements about including a temporary pass for certain immigrant workers.
Oh, I heard something about this. Farmers.
Yes, immigrant farmers and also certain hospitality workers. He explained this would allow employers more control and require tax payments. His reasoning was to avoid destroying a farmer by removing workers, and he noted that farmers wouldn't hire a murderer. So trying to address specific industry labor needs there.
Okay. And finally, as this bill dominates the whole legislative agenda, is the administration doing anything else on the economic front?
Well, they say they are. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett have spoken of trying to finalize a flurry of trade deals, apparently by a July 9 deadline for some tariff hikes. They mentioned the UK and China already having successful talks. However, Hassett explicitly stated that the administration is prioritizing the big, beautiful bill above these other negotiations.
So the bill is clearly priority number one.
Underscoring its central importance, yes.
Okay. So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you, our listener? You've now hopefully got a much deeper understanding of this incredibly complex, multifaceted bill. We've looked at its financial implications, its profound impact on healthcare, and the high-stakes political maneuvering required for its passage. We've tried to cut through the noise and give you the core insights.
And just to reiterate, while this bill is clearly being framed as a critical legislative achievement for the current administration, the debate surrounding its long-term costs, its effects on social programs like Medicaid, and even these new taxes on emerging industries like wind and solar, they are far from settled. This isn't really the end of the story, but maybe the start of its real-world implications, should it pass.
Yeah, exactly. And this raises, I think, an important question for you to consider as you follow this. Beyond the immediate political wins or losses, what are the lasting implications of using mechanisms like the current policy baseline for cost estimation, or using the budget reconciliation process for such sweeping, potentially partisan legislation? How might these procedural choices impact the perception of government spending, accountability, and maybe even the future of bipartisan cooperation in the years to come?
That's a really key question.
It is. So we encourage you to stay informed as these legislative processes unfold and to critically evaluate how these decisions might shape the nation's future.